I was in the middle of fixing a leaky faucet in the kitchen when I heard the knock. It wasn't loud or urgent, just 3 soft raps against the front door. Claire was upstairs, preparing for a client meeting, so I figured I'd handle it. Wiping my hands on a rag, I walked over, expecting maybe a delivery or one of our neighbors. Instead, I found a man standing on the porch, dressed sharply in a tailored suit. His face looked vaguely familiar, though I couldn't place where I'd seen him before. "Can I help you?" I asked, opening the door just enough to speak. He smiled, a little too comfortably. "Hi, I'm here for Claire. She's expecting me." "For Claire?" I frowned. "What for?" The man tilted his head slightly, as if confused by the question. "A consultation," he said slowly. "She didn't mention I'd be coming?" "No," I said, feeling a prickle of unease. "She didn't." The man's smile faltered for just a moment, but he recovered quickly. "Ah, I must have gotten the time wrong. My apologies. I'll give her a call." Before I could respond, he pulled out his phone, already dialing as he stepped off the porch and out of sight. I shut the door, my gut twisting. Something about the encounter felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Who was it? Claire's voice startled me as she came down the stairs, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. "Some guy looking for you," I said, turning to face her. "He said he had a consultation." Her expression didn't change, but I noticed the slight pause in her step. "Oh, that must have been Mr. Harrington. He's a new client. I told him to call first, but he probably got confused." "Sorry about that. Didn't seem confused to me," I muttered, watching her closely. Claire shrugged, brushing past me. "You know how clients can be. Always rushing, always assuming. I'll handle it." And just like that, she was gone, retreating into her office and closing the door behind her. I stood there for a moment, the uneasy feeling in my chest growing stronger. But I pushed it aside. Claire had always been the professional one, the one who knew how to manage people. If she said it was fine, I had no reason not to believe her. At least, that's what I told myself. The unease lingered longer than I expected. Later that evening, as Claire went about her usual routine, cooking dinner, chatting about the latest book she was reading, I found myself watching her more closely than usual. She seemed normal. Nothing in her demeanor suggested she was hiding anything. And yet, the memory of that man on the porch gnawed at me. "Was everything okay with your client?" I asked as we sat down to eat. Claire looked up from her plate, her expression unreadable for a moment before breaking into a smile. "Oh yes, just a mix-up. It happens." She didn't elaborate, and I didn't press further. But that night, as I lay in bed next to her, staring at the ceiling while she slept soundly, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next few weeks passed without incident, though the nagging suspicion in the back of my mind refused to go away. Every now and then, I'd catch little things, Claire's phone buzzing late at night, or her hurried explanations when I asked about her meetings. She never gave me a reason to doubt her outright, but the little inconsistencies began to pile up. Then, one evening, I came home earlier than usual. Claire hadn't been expecting me. I'd finished a meeting at work ahead of schedule and decided to surprise her with takeout from her favorite Thai place. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked out front, a sleek, black sedan that looked wildly out of place in our quiet neighborhood. Curiosity piqued, I grabbed the food and walked up to the house. The front door was locked, which was unusual. Claire always left it unlocked when she was home. Fumbling with my keys, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. "Claire?" I called out, setting the food on the kitchen counter. No response. The house was quiet, eerily so. I checked the living room, then the dining room, but there was no sign of her. My heart started to race as I made my way upstairs. Her office door was closed, but faint voices drifted from inside. I stopped in front of the door, straining to hear. "Don't worry about it. He never comes home this early," Claire was saying, her tone light and confident. Another voice, deeper and unfamiliar, responded. I couldn't make out the words, but the casual intimacy in his tone made my stomach churn. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside. Claire was seated at her desk, a glass of wine in hand, while the man from the porch, Mr. Harrington, apparently, stood beside her, leaning casually against the desk. They both froze when they saw me. Sam! Claire's voice was high and nervous. What are you doing home? I stared at her, then at the man, who had the audacity to look mildly amused. I live here, I said slowly, my voice cold. What's going on? Nothing. Claire stood, her smile too bright, too forced. We were just going over some documents for his consultation. It's nothing to worry about. The man didn't say a word, but the smirk on his face told me everything I needed to know. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, ignoring Claire's frantic calls after me. My mind was racing, 1,000 thoughts colliding at once. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't sure I could trust her, and that terrified me. That night, I sat in my car for over an hour, the Thai food forgotten in the back seat. I replayed every interaction with Claire over the past few months, every excuse, every hurried explanation. The pieces of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was assembling began to fall into place. The next day felt like a blur. After catching Claire with Harrington in her office, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life was unraveling. The image of their smug faces stayed with me, taunting me, reminding me that something was deeply wrong. Claire acted as if nothing had happened. She smiled over breakfast, chatting about mundane things like grocery lists and weekend plans, her demeanor effortless and normal. But I couldn't see her the same way anymore. Every word felt rehearsed, every glance calculated. My mind was racing as I replayed everything she'd said the night before, searching for clues I might have missed. How long had she been lying? And how much of what I thought was real had been a lie? By the time I got to work, I was on edge. My students' voices blurred together as I tried to teach. Dates and events I'd memorized years ago suddenly felt jumbled, my thoughts consumed by Claire. The memory of Harrington standing beside her, so comfortable in my home, felt like a splinter I couldn't pull out. I needed answers. That evening, I tried to test the waters. You seemed busy last night, I said casually as we sat down to dinner. Claire raised an eyebrow, her fork pausing mid-air. Oh? What do you mean? With Harrington, I replied, keeping my tone even. You two seemed close. Her reaction was almost imperceptible, a flicker of tension in her jaw, the tiniest pause before she smiled. He's just a client, she said smoothly. I told you, Sam, it's all business. Right? I said, nodding. Just business. She leaned forward, her smile widening. You don't have to worry about me, you know? Everything I do is for us. For this family. I forced a smile, but her words felt like a knife twisting in my gut. That night, while Claire slept soundly beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her reassurances hadn't eased my doubts. In fact, they'd made them worse. Her smile, her calmness, it all felt too perfect, too rehearsed. I couldn't ignore the feeling that there was more to her meetings than she was letting on. And if I wanted the truth, I'd have to find it myself. The next day, I waited until Claire left for one of her meetings before making my move. Her office was my first stop. The faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air as I rummaged through her desk drawers, looking for anything that might give me a clue. At first, I found nothing out of the ordinary, just stacks of paper, client files, and office supplies. But then I opened the bottom drawer and found something that stopped me cold. It was a black leather planner, neatly tucked away beneath a stack of folders. I flipped it open, my heart pounding as I scanned the pages. Each week was meticulously filled with notes, dates, and names. But one name stood out above the rest, Harrington. His name appeared multiple times, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week, always with the same vague description, meeting. But it wasn't just Harrington. There were other names too, names I didn't recognize, all written in Claire's precise handwriting. Each entry had a time and a location, but no details about the nature of the meetings. My stomach churned as I stared at the page, the implications sinking in. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention. Every time Claire left the house, I took note of the time and where she said she was going. Her phone, which she used to leave lying around, was now glued to her side. She became more secretive, brushing off my questions with vague answers or laughing them off entirely. Then, one evening, I decided to follow her. She'd left the house just after 7 p.m., wearing a fitted dress and heels that seemed too formal for a business meeting. I waited a few minutes before grabbing my keys and following her car down the street. She drove to a nearby hotel, a sleek, modern building that catered to high-end clients. My chest tightened as I parked a few spaces away, watching as she stepped out of the car and disappeared through the front entrance. I stayed in the car for almost an hour, my mind racing. What was she doing in there? Was she meeting Harrington? Someone else? The questions swirled in my head, each one more damning than the last. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped out of the car and walked into the hotel. The lobby was quiet, save for the faint sound of classical music playing overhead. I approached the front desk, my heart pounding in my chest. The receptionist looked up, smiling politely. "Can I help you?" "Yes," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I'm looking for my wife. She checked in earlier this evening." The receptionist frowned. "Do you know her room number?" No, I admitted. "Her name is Claire. Claire Matthews." The receptionist's expression shifted to one of sympathy. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't give out that information. It's against policy." I nodded, backing away from the desk. My hands were shaking as I walked back to the car, the weight of my suspicions pressing down on me. She was hiding something big, and I was going to find out what. The next day, I called in sick to work. I couldn't focus on anything but Claire and the puzzle I was trying to piece together. I spent hours going through her emails, her planner, and her bank statements, looking for anything that might give me a clearer picture. The more I dug, the more I realized just how little I knew about her life outside of our home. By the time Claire came home that evening, I'd gathered enough to confirm what I already suspected. She'd been lying to me for months, if not years. The meetings, the hotel visits, the unexplained expenses, it all pointed to one undeniable conclusion. But I still didn't have the whole picture. I needed more. That weekend, Claire announced she'd be working late on Saturday. "It's just a last-minute client thing," she said, kissing me on the cheek. "I'll try not to be too late." I nodded, feigning nonchalance. "Take your time." As soon as she left, I grabbed my keys and followed her. This time, I wasn't going to sit back and wonder. I was going to see it with my own eyes. When I arrived at the hotel, I parked a few spaces away and waited. Sure enough, Claire's car was already there. I watched as she stepped out, laughing and chatting with a man I didn't recognize. They entered the building together, and I followed at a distance, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside, I watched as they headed toward the elevators. The man leaned in close, whispering something in Claire's ear that made her laugh. My stomach churned as the doors closed behind them, taking them out of sight. For the first time, I felt the full weight of her betrayal. She wasn't just lying. She was living an entirely different life, one I had no part in, and I was determined to uncover every last detail. The night air felt colder than usual as I parked my car 2 blocks from the house. Claire had assured me earlier that her client would stop by for a quick meeting. She'd kissed me on the cheek and said with a bright smile, "Don't wait up, it might run late." But this time, I wasn't going to wait up. I was going to see the truth for myself. Our house looked the same as always, warm and inviting, its golden light spilling out onto the lawn. But as I crept closer, something felt wrong. I ducked into the bushes near the window, peering through a small gap in the curtains. Inside, Claire was sitting on the couch, holding a glass of wine. Harrington was beside her, sitting far too close, his arm resting casually along the back of the couch. Another man I didn't recognize was on her other side, leaning in as he spoke. A third man stood by the fireplace, pouring himself a drink from the bar cart. It wasn't just the presence of these men. It was Claire's demeanor that sent a chill down my spine. She was laughing, her smile wide and carefree, as though she had not a single worry in the world. Harrington leaned in closer, murmuring something that made her laugh even louder. She didn't pull back. Instead, she smiled, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The third man approached the couch, holding his drink, and said something that made them all laugh. Claire turned toward him, her expression bright, and took the glass he offered. They clinked their glasses together as though toasting to some private joke. Then, Harrington shifted closer to her, his arm dropping to her shoulder. She didn't flinch. She didn't move away. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms as I watched. One of the men leaned toward her, his hand brushing lightly against hers. She glanced at him, her smile widening, as though this was all perfectly normal. But what stopped me cold was Harrington's next move. He loosened his tie, pulling it free with practiced ease. His casualness, his confidence, it was infuriating. He wasn't just in my house. He acted like he belonged there. Claire didn't stop him. Instead, she laughed at something the man beside her said, her attention flicking between them. I couldn't take it anymore. My rage boiled over as I stormed to the front door, my footsteps heavy and deliberate. I didn't knock. I didn't hesitate. I threw the door open and stepped inside. The laughter stopped instantly. Claire's smile froze as she turned to see me standing there. Harrington leaned back, his tie now hanging loosely around his neck, while the other two men exchanged glances. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. "What is this?" I asked, my voice trembling with fury. "Sam," Claire said quickly, standing up, "it's not what it looks like." "Don't," I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't insult me by pretending this is normal." Harrington adjusted his tie, his smirk maddeningly calm. "Look, it's nothing personal," he said. "Claire just likes to keep things lively." His words hit me like a slap to the face. I turned to him, my fists clenching at my sides. "You've been coming into my house, sitting on my furniture, acting like this is okay?" Harrington shrugged. "She invited us," he said simply, his tone dripping with arrogance. That was the last straw. I lunged at him, my vision going red with anger. My fist connected with his jaw, sending him stumbling back. The other men jumped to their feet, shouting protests, but I didn't care. I wanted him to feel even a fraction of the humiliation and rage coursing through me. "Stop it," Claire screamed, grabbing my arm and trying to pull me back. "Sam, please stop." I shook her off, my chest heaving as I turned my glare on her. "Don't you dare tell me to stop," I growled. "Not after what you've done." The other men took the opportunity to leave, muttering hurried excuses as they bolted for the door. Harrington was the last to go, wiping blood from his lip as he shot me a glare. "You've got issues, man," he said before slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. Claire stood in the middle of the room, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes filled with tears. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "How long?" I asked finally, my voice quiet but firm. "Sam," she hesitated, her voice trembling. "It's not what you think." "Don't lie to me," I said, my tone sharper now. "How long?" Her shoulders shook as she whispered, "A year. A year." The word echoed in my mind, each repetition a fresh stab to the chest. For an entire year, she'd been living this double life, betraying me in ways I couldn't comprehend. I sank onto the couch, my head in my hands. "Why?" I asked softly. "Why would you do this?" She swallowed hard, her tears streaming freely now. "I don't know," she said. "It wasn't supposed to go this far." I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and broken. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," I repeated. "But it did, Claire. It did." That night, I packed a bag and left. Claire begged me to stay, to talk things through, but I couldn't. Not after what I'd seen. As I drove aimlessly through the city, the weight of her betrayal pressed down on me like a suffocating blanket. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same. The night I left, I didn't know where I was going. I just drove, the city lights blurring past as my mind raced. The betrayal I had witnessed was like a raw wound, and every memory of Claire felt like salt being rubbed into it. I parked in an empty lot near the edge of town and sat there in silence, staring at the steering wheel as the weight of everything pressed down on me. I couldn't go back, not yet, but I also couldn't move forward without figuring out what to do next. One thing was clear. I needed to reclaim control over my life. Claire had torn apart everything we'd built, and now I was left to pick up the pieces. The next morning, I checked into a motel. It wasn't much, a small, dingy room with peeling wallpaper and a faint smell of mildew, but it was quiet. It gave me space to think. I spent hours going over every detail, every clue I had missed over the past year. How had I been so blind? What signs had I ignored because I wanted to believe the best in her? I started writing things down, piecing together the timeline of her betrayal. The late-night meetings, the mysterious clients, the hotel receipts. I laid it all out, trying to make sense of it. But no matter how much I analyzed, one question kept coming back to me. Why? I didn't think Claire's betrayal was about love or even desire. It felt more calculated than that, as though she thrived on the power and control it gave her. The thought made my stomach churn. She had manipulated me, played me for a fool, and I had let her. But not anymore. Over the next few days, my anger crystallized into something sharper, something colder. I wasn't just angry, I was determined. Claire had destroyed our marriage, humiliated me in ways I couldn't even begin to describe. I wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. If she thought she could ruin my life without consequences, she was wrong. I started making plans. Revenge wasn't just about hurting her. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my power. It was about showing her, and anyone else who thought they could use me, that I wasn't someone to be trifled with. The first step was gathering more information. I needed to know the full extent of her lies. Claire had always been meticulous, but I knew her habits well enough to find the cracks in her defenses. I accessed our shared accounts, combing through bank statements and emails for anything that could give me leverage. What I found made my blood boil all over again. There were charges for expensive dinners at restaurants I'd never been to, hotel stays that coincided with her business trips, and even gifts, jewelry, clothing, things she had never brought home. She had been living a life I knew nothing about, using our money to fund her deceit. But it wasn't just the money. It was the sheer audacity of it all. Claire had crafted an elaborate web of lies, and I had been too trusting to see through it. Well, not anymore. The second step was rebuilding myself. Claire had taken so much from me. My trust, my stability, my sense of self-worth. But I wasn't going to let her take everything. I started going to the gym, channeling my anger into something productive. I spent hours lifting weights, running on the treadmill, pushing my body to its limits. It wasn't just about getting stronger. It was about reclaiming a sense of control. I also reached out to friends I hadn't seen in years. For too long, my world had revolved around Claire, and I had let other relationships fall by the wayside. Reconnecting with old friends reminded me of who I was before her betrayal. It reminded me that I wasn't defined by her actions. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, I began to feel like myself again. But I wasn't done yet. I hadn't forgotten about Claire, or the humiliation she had caused me. I had been patient, biding my time, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, that moment was finally here. I started by sending her a letter. It was short, concise, and to the point. I told her I knew everything. I detailed her lies, her infidelity, her betrayal, and I made it clear that there would be consequences. I didn't tell her what those consequences were. That was part of the plan. I wanted her to feel the same anxiety, the same uncertainty that she had made me feel for so long. The next step was setting the stage. I gathered all the evidence I had, emails, receipts, messages, and made copies. I wasn't just going to confront Claire privately. I wanted the world to see her for who she really was. I reached out to a lawyer, ensuring that I had everything I needed to protect myself legally. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about securing my future. Finally, I planned the confrontation. I didn't want it to be in private, where she could manipulate the situation to her advantage. I wanted it to be public, where she couldn't hide behind her lies. I waited until one of her social gatherings, a dinner party with mutual friends, and walked in uninvited. The room fell silent as I entered. Claire's smile froze on her lips as she saw me standing there, holding a folder filled with the evidence of her betrayal. Our friends looked back and forth between us, their confusion turning to shock as I began to speak. "Claire," I said, my voice steady, "it's time everyone knows the truth." She tried to interrupt, but I didn't let her. I laid out everything, her lies, her deceit, her affairs, in painstaking detail. I handed out copies of the evidence to our friends, watching as their faces shifted from confusion to disgust. Claire's mask of confidence cracked, her composure crumbling as the weight of her actions came crashing down. By the time I finished, she was in tears, her carefully crafted world unraveling before her eyes. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. I had done what I came to do. It wasn't just about exposing her, it was about reclaiming my life. That night, as I walked away from the party, I felt lighter than I had in months. Claire had tried to destroy me, but in the end, she had only destroyed herself. I had taken back control, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Walking away from Claire that night wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning. The weight of her betrayal no longer crushed me. Instead, it fueled me. For months, I had been consumed by anger and humiliation, but now I had clarity. I knew exactly what I needed to do. The first step was to ensure that my future was no longer tied to hers. I contacted my lawyer the next morning to initiate divorce proceedings. Claire's betrayal had been public, and the evidence I'd gathered was overwhelming. She wouldn't have much ground to stand on in court. My lawyer assured me that the process, while painful, would be swift and definitive. It was time to cut the last ties binding me to her. While the legal proceedings moved forward, I focused on rebuilding my life. The gym became a sanctuary, a place where I could channel my anger and frustration into something productive. I pushed myself harder than I ever had, lifting heavier weights, running faster miles. Every drop of sweat felt like a step toward reclaiming the man I used to be. I also threw myself into my career. Teaching had always been a passion, but after Claire's betrayal, it became a lifeline. I started taking on additional responsibilities, volunteering for after-school programs, and mentoring new teachers. My hard work didn't go unnoticed. Within months, I was offered a promotion, head of the history department, a role I had once thought was out of reach. For the first time in a long time, I felt pride in myself. But as I moved forward, Claire's presence lingered like a shadow. Mutual friends reached out to me, some offering sympathy, others fishing for details about the scandal. I kept my responses brief, refusing to engage in gossip. Claire had already taken enough from me. I wouldn't let her take my dignity as well. Still, I couldn't ignore the whispers that followed her. She had tried to continue her charade, hosting parties and acting as though nothing had changed. But the fallout from that night at the dinner party was impossible to contain. Friends distanced themselves, clients vanished, and her carefully curated image began to crumble. It wasn't just about what she had done to me. It was about the lies she had told everyone around her. One day, months after I had left, I received an email from Claire. The subject line was simple, "Please." I stared at the screen for a long time before opening it. The message was short, just a few lines begging me to meet with her. She claimed she wanted to apologize, to explain herself, to try and make amends. Part of me wanted to delete the email without replying, but another part, curiosity, maybe, compelled me to respond. I agreed to meet her, but only in a neutral, public place. We met at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. Claire looked different, thinner, tired, as though the weight of her choices had finally caught up with her. She smiled weakly as I sat down, but I didn't return it. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice soft. I nodded, waiting for her to continue. She hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I know I hurt you, Sam. I know I betrayed your trust. And I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to tell you how sorry I am." Her words hung in the air, heavy and hollow. I studied her for a moment, searching for sincerity in her eyes. Maybe she meant it. Maybe she didn't. At that point, it didn't matter. "I appreciate the apology," I said finally, "but it doesn't change anything." Claire's face fell, but she nodded. "I understand," she said quietly. I miss you. I miss us." "There is no us anymore," I said firmly. "You made sure of that." She didn't argue. She just nodded again, her shoulders slumping as she looked away. I left shortly after, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. Her apology didn't undo the damage, but it gave me closure. For the first time, I felt like I could truly move on. And I did. Months turned into a year, and my life continued to improve. The divorce was finalized with little drama, and I walked away with more than I had expected, both financially and emotionally. I poured myself into my work, taking on new challenges and climbing the ladder of success. My reputation as a dedicated and talented teacher grew, and with it came new opportunities. But it wasn't just about work. I started reconnecting with the world outside of my career, meeting new people and rediscovering the joy of companionship. I attended social events, joined local groups, and even dipped my toes back into the dating world. It wasn't easy at first. The scars Claire left were still fresh, but slowly, I began to open up again. Then I met her. Her name was Julia, and she was unlike anyone I had ever known. She was smart, kind, and unpretentious, with a laugh that could light up a room. We met at a charity event for the local library, a cause she was deeply passionate about. Our conversation started casually, but as the night went on, I found myself drawn to her warmth and sincerity. She wasn't just a distraction. She was a reminder that love could be pure and untainted. Julia didn't push me to open up about my past. She listened when I was ready to share and never judged me for the pain I carried. With her, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: hope. A year after we met, Julia and I stood in the same cafe where I had met Claire for her apology. This time, the air was light, filled with the scent of coffee and the hum of laughter from nearby tables. I reached across the table, taking Julia's hand in mine. "I've been thinking," I said, smiling at her, "about us, about the future." Her eyes sparkled with curiosity. "Oh, and what have you been thinking?" "That I don't want to let fear hold me back anymore," I said. "I don't want to let the past define me. I want to move forward, with you." Julia's smile widened, and she squeezed my hand. "I want that too," she said simply. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. The shadows of Claire's betrayal no longer haunted me. They were just memories now, distant and fading, as I built a new life with someone who valued trust, honesty, and love. The years that followed Claire's betrayal were the most transformative of my life. What had started as devastation turned into an awakening, a chance to rebuild myself from the ground up. Looking back, I realized that her betrayal, painful as it was, had been the catalyst for a better future. After my divorce, I focused on growth. I channeled my energy into my career, my health, and my relationships with the people who truly mattered. Claire had shattered my trust, but she hadn't broken me. If anything, she had made me stronger. And now, years later, I could finally look at my life and feel proud of what I had accomplished. One of the most pivotal moments came when I was promoted to principal at the school where I had spent most of my career. It wasn't just a professional milestone. It was proof that I could rise above the chaos and find stability. My colleagues congratulated me, my students celebrated, and for the first time, I felt like I had reclaimed my place in the world. Julia was by my side through it all. She had become more than just a partner. She was my rock, my confidant, and my source of inspiration. With her, I didn't have to question motives or second-guess intentions. She was honest and kind, her love unwavering and pure. On the anniversary of the day I left Claire, I stood on the balcony of the home Julia and I shared, watching the sunrise paint the sky with soft hues of pink and orange. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of freshly brewed coffee wafting from the kitchen. Julia stepped onto the balcony, a steaming mug in each hand. She handed me one and smiled, her eyes reflecting the light of the morning. "You've been quiet," she said gently. "What's on your mind?" "Just thinking," I said, taking a sip of coffee. "About how far I've come. About how far we've come." She leaned against the railing beside me, her gaze thoughtful. "Do you ever regret what happened with her?" I shook my head. "No," I said firmly. "It hurt, and it broke me for a while. But if it hadn't happened, I wouldn't be here now. I wouldn't have found you." Julia smiled softly, setting her mug down to take my hand. "I'm glad you found me too," she said. "You deserve this. You deserve happiness." Her words settled over me like a warm blanket, soothing and comforting. For so long, I had let Claire's betrayal define me, shape me. But standing there with Julia, I realized that chapter of my life was finally closed. It no longer held power over me. In the months that followed, Julia and I made plans for the future. We talked about traveling, about starting a family, about building a life that was rooted in trust and mutual respect. I had spent years in the shadow of betrayal, but now I was stepping into the light. One evening, as we sat together in our living room, Julia surprised me with a question. "Have you ever thought about reaching out to Claire?" she asked cautiously. "To see how she's doing?" I was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "I've thought about it," I admitted, "but I don't think I need to. She's part of my past, not my present." Julia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's fair," she said. "But if you ever change your mind, I'd understand." Her understanding meant more to me than I could express. Julia wasn't just supportive. She was wise and compassionate in a way that reminded me why I had fallen in love with her. On the day Julia and I got married, I stood at the altar, looking into her eyes as she smiled at me with pure, unfiltered joy. Our friends and family surrounded us, their laughter and love filling the air. In that moment, I knew I had made it. I had survived the darkest days of my life and come out stronger on the other side. As we exchanged vows, I promised Julia that I would never let the past tarnish our future. She had given me hope when I thought I had none left, and I was determined to cherish her every day of my life. Years later, I found myself standing in front of a classroom, sharing my story with a group of students. They were part of an elective course I had created on resilience and personal growth, a project I had started after becoming principal. The goal was to help students navigate the challenges of life with strength and determination. I didn't share every detail, of course, but I told them about the betrayal, the pain, and the journey that followed. I told them how I had rebuilt my life, how I had found love and success again. And as I spoke, I saw the light of understanding in their eyes. "You can't always control what happens to you," I said, my voice steady, "but you can control how you respond. You can choose to let it break you, or you can choose to let it make you stronger." After class, a student approached me. She was quiet, her eyes downcast, but there was a determination in her voice when she spoke. "Thank you," she said softly, "for sharing that. It gives me hope." Her words stayed with me long after she left. They reminded me why I had chosen to share my story, not to dwell on the past, but to show others that there was life beyond pain, that there was hope, even in the darkest moments. As I stood on the balcony of my home that evening, watching another sunset with Julia by my side, I felt a sense of peace I had never known before. The past was behind me, its sharp edges dulled by time and healing. The future stretched out before me, bright and full of promise. Claire's betrayal had once been the defining moment of my life, but now it was just a memory. What defined me now was the love I had found, the strength I had built, and the life I had created. And for that, I was endlessly grateful.